Imagine a world where every sound whispers of magic and every shadow hides the secrets of ancient legends. Today we will delve into a mysterious story where the spinster is not just an artisan, but the keeper of secrets that can change the fates of entire villages. On a dark night, by the light of a lamp at the window, an old woman sits at her spinning wheel. She bent over the spinning wheel, occasionally raising her head, and looks out the window, behind which the blizzard is playing out. She is waiting. The house is quiet, even the mice are not rustling in the cellar. Suddenly the spinster raises her head, her uncombed tresses reveal her ugly face. She is blind, only the dark gaps of her eye sockets remain. She cannot see, but she hears and smells. She spins and waits. The door opens, letting in the icy chill, snowflakes swirl, turning into transparent drops. A man stands on the threshold, snow sticking to his boots. He looks silently at the spinster who, hearing the footsteps, raised her head. They were silent for a few minutes, and then the thin thread broke. Everything locked up, frozen. The man shuddered and fell at the old woman's feet. The blind spinster widened her lips in a grin and sat down at her spinning wheel again. 4 pairs of eyes stared fearfully at the black-haired girl. They gathered around the warm stove and took turns telling scary stories. The house was warm and smelled of buns baked by her grandmother. After seeing her friends off, the girl went back into the house and sat down at the table. Her grandmother sat in front of a card layout and looked at them thoughtfully. In her eyes froze bewilderment and fear. "Why are you scaring your friends?" Grandma suddenly asked. "I don't scare them, they tell stories too. They make up or retell what they have heard somewhere, and you tell the truth." "Bah, don't start. You're an adult and you believe in fairy tales. There's no such thing as a spinster or anything else for that matter." "Let me disagree with you, my dear. Time will come and you'll believe, and then my fairy tales will come in handy." Grandma patted her granddaughter's hair affectionately. "But until then, don't tell such stories." That night the girl dreamed of an old woman at the spinning wheel, with black holes instead of eyes. She reached out her bony hands and tried to grab her. The girl woke up to her screaming, deciding to stop with such stories. Many years later, the girl sat under an old linden tree in the park. She had laid out a plaid on the grass and had taken out sandwiches, tea, and a book. Her appearance was peculiar, a bright, beautiful gypsy. In truth, few people believed in her nationality. Prejudice. Lockie twirled the tip of her braid, trying to concentrate on the book. She wasn't reading a book on magic and sorcery today. It was an ordinary tabloid novel, and there was no way she could concentrate. Her thoughts were far away from the beautiful park. The day before, a girl named Marina had approached her and told her a strange story. "In our family, there is a story with a bad ending. Some girls in the family were born with a mark on their arm, and here, the one who has such a mark probably will not live to 33 years. It works every time. Let me see the mark." "I understand you have it," the Shovihani asked gently. Marina held out her hand. On a thin girl's wrist, a birthmark was blackened by a bracelet. Like a predatory snake, a black curse bracelet was wrapped around the girl's arm. Lockie immediately recognized the witch's harness, but she had never before seen it on a person far from magic. And the fact that the girl is not a witch and is not into the occult, the gypsy already saw. A witch's harness is a terrible curse for any practicing witch. Most often they tried to bind a witch's powers or bind her soul to a place. Taking Marina's hand, Lockie tried to look into the future, and what she saw there did not please her at all. "Will you help me? I really don't want to die." Marina was almost crying, and it was obvious that she was very scared. "My mom had a sister, Olga. Olga had this mark too. She was killed. She didn't live to be 20 for 6 months. I'll do my best." Lockie made no promises. The next day, Shovihani decided to just relax in the park. Thoughts of Marina did not leave her head. There was something else besides the harness, something sinister. As the sun was setting, Lockie was getting ready to go home when the phone rang. "Help!" Through the cries and static, Lockie recognized Marina's voice. "Where are you?" "At the old pond," Marina sobbed. "I'll be there soon." About 40 minutes later, Lockie found a frightened Marina in a thick thicket. Look at the girl was terrible. The back as if whip-stripped, bleeding thin wounds already covered with crust. Marina was shaking. Lockie whispered a spell in her ear to relieve the shock. I don't know who it was. It was no one. It was like the air was whipping me. And then I saw a strange old woman with braids. Literally for a second I found myself in another place. And there was an old woman behind a spinning wheel. I've only seen that in movies. She had a rope tied around her arm. Rope? Was there yarn? Yes. Tell you what, let's go back to my place, get these wounds treated, and then we'll see. I think I know who she is. I used to tell stories about her myself. Lockie frantically leafed through her grandmother's notes, old books on witchcraft and magic. Nothing. The gypsy kicked the wooden chest in frustration and heard a strange sound. A click. She leaned over the open chest. Wow. Double-bottomed. Apparently, when she kicked the wall of the chest, a secret mechanism had triggered and opened the hiding place. In the hiding place was a very tattered notebook. The ink was blurred in some places, and the text was impossible to read. The fact that Lockie didn't know the language made it difficult to read. She understood the language, but she had never been able to read or write it. Great-grandmother, this is her diary. Surprisingly, in this gypsy family of Shovicani, almost all were literate. The tribesmen marveled at this fact. It was not usual, especially for women. And now she had her great-grandmother's notebook in front of her, and some of it was written down in someone else's language. Lockie sat down on the floor and began to read. Very quickly she realized that it was not just a notebook, it was mostly different cases of encounters with evil, and how to fight it. Someone she had already encountered, the Shovihani recognized from the pages of the diary. She wondered why her grandmother hadn't told her about this notebook, or did she not know herself? She was a young beauty, lived in the village in her parents' house, and was known as the first beauty. She had a lot of suitors to choose from. Finally, she met her love. Maria, he was Ivan. Maria fell in love with him like a cat and wanted to marry him. Only it turned out differently. He didn't love Maria. Ivan rudely drove the girl away, disgraced her in front of everyone. They say that she hangs on Ivan's neck, while he has a bride in the neighboring village. Then Maria went to an old witch who lived on the edge of the forest. She promised to return Ivan for a fee, and Maria agreed. She didn't think about the payment at that moment. By the way, the witch, they say, used to be normal, but no one knew what happened to her. In addition to her witchcraft skills, she was famous as a skillful spinster. For days she sat by the window and spun, humming quietly or chanting, "You can't make out the words." It was as if she was waiting for someone. The witch fulfilled Maria's wish. Ivan came to marry her, but he looked strange, as if he was not himself. The wedding was celebrated for 3 days. Only the groom and the bride sat like at a funeral. Maria still hoped, but when she looked into the groom's eyes, she saw only emptiness and indifference. 3 months later, just after Christmas, Ivan drowned in the river. Maria turned black with grief and was not herself. A little time passed, and one night, when a snowstorm was raging outside, there was a knock at the door. Maria opened the door and for some reason was not surprised to see the very witch on the threshold. "I've come for payment." "What? What payment?" Maria asked. "What kind of payment? You gave your word, I did the job. He's dead. We all die. You lied to me. No, you tricked yourself and you're still doing it. But there's a price to pay for everything. And in the world of magic especially," the witch screeched. "I'll see you in 7 days." "And pay with what?" Maria wanted to ask, but the witch was already gone. 7 days passed. The cold was terrible. Her friends entertained Maria as best they could, trying to distract her from her husband's death. They went skiing. It was fun. Maria herself did not notice how she laughed, felt alive again, and suddenly, her sled hit a stone. She saw the sky clear, close, and in the next second, pain and darkness. In the darkness, she is scared and cold. She feels like she is being dragged somewhere. Maria screams and screams, but no one hears her. Her friends are fussing, calling for help from the others. Breathless, beautiful Maria, Ivan's widow, is lying there. Maria came to herself in a strange house at a spinning wheel, a thin scarlet thread on her hand which seems to dissolve in the yarn. "Well, that's your payment. You'll take my place until you find someone like you, naive and trusting. From now on you're a spinster, spinning the rope that binds the worlds together, and on your hand a witch's harness. When it's removed, your soul will be free." "You took mine off!" The witch laughed and spoke again. "I am free at last. I'm so tired." "For what?" Maria asked. "Everything has to be paid for. I broke the order once too, sat at the spinning wheel on Friday and was punished. Now it's your turn." With these words, the old witch seemed to vanish into thin air and disappeared completely. Maria cried and realized everything. She had deceived herself. She was put on a harness, like a dog on a chain. The wheel of the spinning wheel spun, and a quiet, sad song about the fate of the unfortunate maiden was sung. In the world, Maria was buried long ago. Only a grave remained at the graveyard. Lockie read the story to the end. Yes, Great-grandmother was not lazy, wrote down everything, and after the story, the woman wrote down her conclusions and ways to help the unhappy soul. It is a cycle, as the wheel of the spinning wheel, so the day is replaced by night. That maiden who became a witch was punished by the goddess Mara, lord of cold and death. She forbade spinning on Friday, and no one breaks the ban. Those who do will be severely punished. That spinning wheel is not a simple spinning wheel, it's a rope, a road between the worlds. The soul can be saved in two ways: to carry out the ritual of burning the harness, and the second, Mara must let the spinster go. Marina sat quiet as a mouse, watching the gypsy. The Shovihani's hair fluttered at her sudden movements, her many thin bracelets jingling melodiously. "Everything seems to be useless," Marina said quietly. "No, we know the main thing, I found the right. Of course Mara herself will not let you go, but the ritual I can quite well do." "There's just one problem," Lockie sat across from the girl. "What's that?" Marina asked. "I need raven feathers and ruta, and some ingredients I have. I know where to get the ruta, but the feathers are a problem." "Why?" It seemed to Marina that feathers were everywhere. The feathers collected from the cemetery are exactly 666. "So, get ready, let's go to the graveyard." The day was drawing towards evening when the girls arrived at the old town cemetery. Many of the graves were abandoned and so overgrown with weeds that you couldn't even see their names. There were crypts in this cemetery, whole family burials. At another time, Lockie would have enjoyed wandering here. The history of the city has been preserved in stone. Here are buried the founders of the city, prominent personalities who took part in the development of the city. Architects, military men, doctors, and many others were buried here, in the first city cemetery. In front of the entrance, Lockie stepped aside for a few moments, put something on the parapet, whispering quietly. Marina did not understand the words, she was already scared out of her wits. "And we will not be chased away?" "What were you doing?" Marina asked in a whisper. She did not like the cemetery in principle, and here it is even darker. "Who? Watchmen here for 40 years since there is no guard, they say. Guard nothing, although in fact this place has a bad reputation," replied Lockie. "I asked permission from the mistress, and left some gifts." "Tell me about this place," Marina asked. She was ready to listen to anything to distract herself. "Let's go, I'm not badly oriented here, we must hurry." Lockie led her companion to the oldest part of the pogost, where the graves are stone crosses, overgrown with moss. At one of the graves in the twilight blackened an incomprehensible pile. "Bingo! It really turned out to be black raven feathers." Marina looked amazed at the gypsy who was busily digging through the pile. "How did you know? Have you forgotten who I am?" Lockie laughed, but her laughter sounded creepy. "I've known this place for a long time. I often perform rituals here." "Why?" "It's quiet, there's no one around, no one bothers me, and I don't bother anyone. Crows often sit in the trees, it's their home. You know that crows are very intelligent birds, their intelligence is sometimes higher than that of some individuals." They were going through the feathers, shining the flashlight on their phones. Lockie was carefully placing the feathers in her bag where the other ritual paraphernalia were, when she suddenly froze. She closed her eyes and listened. Marina looked fearfully at Lockie. "We didn't have time," whispered the Shovihani. She quickly closed the bag of feathers, grabbed her backpack and dragged Marina away deep into the old cemetery. There was a nasty whistling and clicking sound in the air. The sound was repeating and getting closer. Lockie stopped near some crypt, quickly whispered an ancient incantation to hide their presence for a while. Together with Marina, they opened the rusted door of the crypt, the lock on which opened as if by magic. "Sit quietly, so that you do not hear, do not dare to make a sound. Do you understand?" the gypsy woman said sternly. "Got it." Marina nodded. The door to the crypt Lockie not only closed but sealed it with a spell. Soon a fire was blazing between the crypts on a small stone platform. The whistles Lockie heard were heralds of the coming of the unclean. In order to remove the harness, she would need time to perform the ritual, and she would be actively hindered by the witch's helpers. As she began to recite the words of the spell, a strong wind picked up. The icy gusts of wind almost knocked her to the ground, drowning out any words. The fire was about to go out, but suddenly the flames soared up to the sky. It worked, she was heard. She cast black raven feathers, white beans, stone salt, and ruta as she recited spells. A horrible stench of burning feathers and rotten meat floated over the graveyard. Gradually the foul odor changed, and soon there was a pop and a whiff of ozone, like after a thunderstorm. Lockie relaxed, but suddenly the flames of the fire rose to the sky again, and an invisible force threw the gypsy into the wall. For a couple of minutes, Lockie lay motionless, trying to catch her breath. She couldn't see her opponent, but she could hear him. The spinster was not as simple as she had thought. She would try to stop Lockie from completing the ritual, or she would remain chained by the harness. Phew! There was a sharp whistle and Lockie was thrown again, only now towards the bonfire. The flames of the fire were raging. All that was left to complete the ritual was to throw the special amulet. Lockie took the amulet out of her pocket and began to loudly recite the last words of the spell. A strong wind carried the words away, but she knew her words had reached their destination. At the last moment, as she reached out to throw the amulet into the fire, she was roughly kicked under her knees. Unable to keep her balance, Lockie flew into the fire. A cry of pain came from the crypt, and there was silence. As she fell, Lockie put her hands forward and practically flew into the fire. As she felt the skin on her arms burn, pain seized her body. With difficulty, the gypsy unclenched her burned hand and the amulet fell into the fire. An ancient fire protection spell her grandmother had once cast saved her now. Lockie had a fright. Her hands were badly burned, but she was alive. She rolled onto her back and stared up at the night sky. The wind had died down, the fire was almost out. Had she won? There was no strength to rise. Lockie closed her eyes, trying to see into the future. Lockie, hey, are you okay? I'll call an ambulance. Marinka was crying over her. It worked! Look! She shook her hand in front of Lockie's face. The harness had indeed disappeared. Not even a thin strip remained. At last, the curse of the witch's harness was lifted. Lockie smiled and fainted. Lockie lay in the hospital bed looking out the window at the passing day. The doctors promised to let her go home in a couple days. It would be hard to be on her own for the first time. Her hands were bandaged and every day she had to undergo painful dressings, but the prognosis was encouraging. At least she hasn't lost mobility in her fingers. When she gets home, she'll be able to use her grandmother's recipes to heal her wounds in no time. Marina came almost every day. She told me the news brought goodies and homemade food. She also came the day before the discharge. Lockie had just returned from dressing. I don't know how to thank you for helping me. You saved my life, Marina said. You know the tariff, but seriously, I may need your help someday, replied Lockie. Okay. Lockie looked at Marina's back and thought about her own thoughts. Something was bothering her. The premonition of trouble could be felt physically. But lying in the hospital, Lockie cannot do anything. With difficulty, Lockie got out of bed and began to slowly change her clothes. It took her over an hour to change her hospital shirt into her own clothes. Luckily it was late and no one came into the room. She slipped out of the room and 10 minutes later was in a cab.